Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes.
One of the aims of the record was to sort of look at Englishness in a different way, and therefore this title, Selling England by the Pound, seemed to be a good title for the album. So I made my recommendation.
I think one of our best titles ever, actually, Selling England by the Pound, is a great phrase. You know, Peter on stage with that headgear thing looking a bit like something on the back of a coin. It was a great sort of setting for the song. I think the first part of the song was great. I think the Moonlit Night bit was okay, a bit busy. But I think one of our best album titles, actually.
As far as I remember, Selling England was a relatively happy, calm period in the band's history.
We used to have writing sessions. We didn't necessarily write sort of all in one go, but quite a lot of Selling England was written in one place. And I remember funnily enough, on this particular record, we were a bit stuck for ideas. We had 2 or 3 things that we knew we had. There was this riff that Steve had been playing on stage and all over the place, which we all thought was really good. And we knew we wanted to do something with that. And we developed that into the song I Know What I Like. And it was a quite simple thing, which was quite good for us, really. But we just thought it had a very strong atmosphere. So there's that. And then I had these 3 bits I'd written, which I originally assumed would go into different songs. But I think probably because the others sort of wanted my stuff sort of kind of a Banks ghetto, they all ended up in the same song, which ended up being Firth of Fifth. And I really just strung the 3 bits together and made sense of them in a way to make them good. And so those were written, and then we wrote this sort of riff that became the first part of Battling Over Epping Forest. Other than that, we didn't really have much else. It was kind of like we were struggling a bit for finding things. So we ended up playing these 3 things sort of every day for a long time, and kind of overworked, particularly Epping Forest. I think we overworked it.
There was all this emphasis on writing songs, and I hadn't really written any songs for the album at that point. There were things that were going on in my private life that made it almost impossible to do that. And so really I just had lots of guitar licks, and I used them all on the album. That was the thing. And in some ways that was perfect. It meant that the album took on a more fusion sort of feel, and it was a little bit closer to 𝗜脾𝘁𝗶𝗶𝗄𝗏 Orchestra. There was some tapping, there was some sticking it through a Leslie cabinet, there was that influence. It was a little bit Beatley, it was a little bit that, but it was still very English. And so I had a great time just being the guitarist, not wondering about, not trying to be a songwriter. I think I only came up with one thing as a song, which was After the Ordeal, which started out as this electric thing. And it plainly didn't work as an electric melody. No one could make it swing. Ended up being this kind of acoustic thing that had an electric bit on the end. But I remember doing this in Chessington. We were in this house in Chessington, and as ever, it was eccentric as ever, I think. For some reason, we were in the living room of a house, and of course it wasn't soundproof, and of course neighbours started to complain, and but nonetheless, the fact that it was slightly out of town, it was slightly quirky, it was slightly strange, it had that homegrown feel about it.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card she plays for two.
Some people see this as a difficult album to make. I wouldn't particularly remember it as being difficult, but I do remember the Chessington sessions when we kind of came up with a cinema show, and then we danced with the Moonlit Night. I was starting to listen to 𝗜脾𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗄𝗏 Orchestra, so I was trying to put my weirdness, my weird time signatures, and into anything that would move, anything that would allow me. So Dancing with the Moonlit Night was, I think, probably some of the instrumental stuff was me and Steve there. I Know What I Like, of course. That was at Unibillings that we wrote that. And that was us doing our Beatle thing, really, which we didn't see any harm in, because we had yet to have a hit single, so nobody else minded either. But of course, as soon as we had a hit single, that's when they started to mind about us having hit singles. I'd Have Plenty, which I you know, I think I know Tony has said that, you know, kind of he could have done without it. I don't remember it. 𝗜ých𝘁𝗲𝗶𝗄𝗏, which is a big tour de force. Cinema Show was a huge tour de force. So I think it's, you know, it's certainly got a lot of what things we still play. Huge stage classics on it. I mean, I like Cinema Show particularly. I thought the first half was great as well. And we were standing a little bit better in the studio.
This album was sort of commercially, it sort of came in at number 3 or something, you know. I think I Know What I Like did help. It was a sort of very minor hit, you know. It did sort of get played on the radio a bit and everything. So I think suddenly... But I think also what had happened was that with the live performance, we were picking up fans all the time. And so when the next album came out, suddenly a lot of people went out and bought it all at the same moment, which gave you a bit of chart presence. And we always went down. The second week was always sort of like 3, and suddenly it was down to sort of 25, you know. But it made you feel that you sort of got somewhere.
I love the album. It's completely bonkers from beginning to end. You've got Pete doing this kind of Scottish plain song thing at the front, this a cappella thing, which then goes into the strangest atmosphere, and it retains that strange atmosphere right through to the end. And I know that, or I believe that Mike and Tony are not as fond of that album, but I felt we'd made this sort of leap forward as players. We were doing stuff that was difficult to play and using techniques that no one else was employing. So this was very good. And Tony had just gotten the voice tapes on the Mellotron, so we had that choral thing as well. We were able to do that. So we could sound like an orchestra. We could sound like a choir, and I also think that when we were touring America, the fact that we were purporting to sell England by the pound, it made us all things quintessentially English. So all the Anglophiles turned out for that. And American audiences, of course, they were divided. Not all of them loved this, but sufficient of them did. And I think it was by the time we hit Los Angeles and we were doing a series of Christmas concerts, I really felt the band was absolutely at its best, and I felt that I was playing guitar in, you know, the world's best band at that point. I really felt that.
We had a following, you know, we had a proper following. It's a cult following, but a proper following. We could play theatres, do a little tour. I think, so you remember that. We were sort of starting to become a band with an identity.
It was stable. I mean, it felt stable too. I mean, you know, Phil and Steve had very much sort of like, I found their feet within the group, I think, both particularly as players, and even Steve was a little bit starting as a writer, although it was still quite early days for him, really. So it was a more integrated sort of thing, you know. It was, you know, still probably, I mean, in all honesty, it probably was still 3, the senior and junior members, you know. But that was sort of to slowly change as time went by.
I think very often people would come in with ideas that were starting points, and then they would sort of get to be the captain of that song, if you like. And some things were emerging in band rehearsal. So it was also a dual approach.
But obviously, apart from the 𝗜ých𝘁𝗲𝗏𝗏, really, most of the other things were things that were emerged in the studio to a large extent, and the development I Know What I Like was very much in the studio. I think we liked. I mean, we always felt that sort of the strongest moments seemed to some reason or other come out of us all improvising and jamming and just sort of things coalescing, really. It was like that very much, and that's what gives you the thrill as well. You're playing along and you know, seeing what might happen. But this obviously, from my own personal point of view, was the first time I'd ever used a synthesizer as well. So it was quite a big move for me. They had this instrument, this Art Pro Soloist thing, which was quite a very simple monophonic synthesizer, but it had quite a nice little range of tones on it. And it was one you didn't have to sort of do any programming, it just was preset sounds, which was nice for me. And obviously the Cinema Show is very much based on that. But I used it throughout the album on little bits and pieces, and it was a really interesting addition to the sort of armoury, you know, having got also these days I was also organ, piano and mellotron. But to have something alternative to play lead on like this, you know, was suddenly opened up possibilities for me. And these little spring keyboard these things had as well, it was very easy to play. It was it certainly opened up my playing possibilities. I used to try and do everything I could with the Hammond organ. I mean, I'd sort of, you just put it through fuzz boxes, wah boxes, switch it on and off. You try using one drawbar, one, or just the percussion sound. You try to get every little thing you get out of it. So you're using 100% of the instrument, is the way I was looking at it. Whereas now with a modern synthesizer, if you use kind of, well, 1/2 of 1%, you're doing well, I think, because they can do so much. A lot of people just switch on and use presets, and that's all they ever do. So it was, it really opened up the possibilities. I mean, the mellotrons were great to an extent, in the sense that they gave you these lovely string sounds and voice sounds and everything, but you couldn't play fast on them or anything. They were just big banks. They were such a crude instrument that when the synthesizers came in, it just opened up the keyboard world so much.
There's always been Ethel. Jacob, wake up, we got to tidy your room now.
Although it may have looked as if, there was more of a pop sensibility on this record, I think sort of Know What I Like was in part an accident. Often when we tried to chase things, we failed miserably. And I think we got to learn really that when we were ourselves and allowed things to happen, that we seemed to have more success and resonance with audiences.
I had this guitar riff that went ding dong ding dong ding dong ding dong, and around the time of rehearsing Foxtrot, I remember putting the guitar through Tony's Leslie cabinets, and Phil and I used to jam on this thing, and no one else was that keen. They said it sounds too much like the Beatles. We're not going to do it. Following album, Phil and I are still jamming away on the same thing, playing it like idiots, and the whole band joined in. It became a jam, it became a song, it became a hit. And I remember joking about this to journalists who said, they wanted to hear it, and I said, you should hear our latest hit single, as if it was a done deal, and I was just joking, and then it became a hit, and I was thrilled, of course.
You must understand that the word pop was, we grew up with the Beatles, the best band in the world, and they were pop. This word pop's become something different now. A great song is a great song. Although we were writing not that at all, they were different pieces, And I suppose I know it's one of the first songs we actually were able to sort of take a short, simple idea and develop it, rather than, like we often do, have too many bits in a song, We just took one riff and sort of made it into a song. Which is great. I mean, it's sort of real character piece too, with Pete's lyric too, I
think. I never really loved the chorus, which, I mean, of course I like my sections, but I think, that was one of Tony's melody on the da 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 da, and after a while I got very bored of it. But it was fun playing the sort of jerkier and jumpier melodies of the verse, and doing that with Phil, and then getting into this more floaty, simple chorus line.
We were always associated with heavy, progressive group and all that, but we came into the business writing pop songs, and it's something we'd always loved, and we were really pleased that we'd actually written one that we thought was pretty good. And probably would have been quite a big hit if it hadn't sort of had this wardrobe in the title, which no one can understand. It was just a really nice sort of effect. It just developed very well. Chorus very strong, and there's some other songs on this which were not quite as. I probably don't have quite so much time for this album as the previous one, purely because I'm not quite so fond of some of the things. I mean, After the Ordeal was the track I really don't like. I've never liked it. And I would have liked it not to have been on the album, but it was sort of, in the end, it's compromised by putting everything we had on. And there's Dance with the Moon at Night, which I like the way it starts very much, but it's not my favourite song, although I know a lot of people like it very much, but it's a slightly weaker track for me.
For her merchandise, he traded in his prize.
Dancing with the Moon at Night was this attempt to sort of mix some traditional folk elements with more contemporary band arrangements, and I think even in the colour of the voice I was using at the time. It was folk influence.
I think Dancing with the Moon at Night has got a lot of great moments on it. And when it starts out, you really don't know where the song's going to go, do you? And there was this da-da-da-da-dum-bum-bum, which Pete wrote on piano and mainly becomes a guitar figure throughout the song. Again, you know, it's someone else's melody interpreted on guitar in two different ways. And there's that lovely bit at the end that we used to call Disney, which they started using for some reason on gardening programs these days. Shot of a gnome, and there's this tinkling 12 string saying, that's Mike's bit there, this sort of repeated chord pattern. But we all operated with rock instruments, but not like a rock group. We all sort of faded ourselves in very, very gently, and we're all being very pastoral.
Yeah, I think there was a growing sense of confidence, and also with that particular track, which I started off writing, I was trying to get a folk reference and sort of, if you like, protect and preserve some of the Englishness. So it was in the opening part particularly trying to capture something that was had more references to Henry VIII than it did to American soul music. And then with the lyric, it was in a sense about the commercialization of English culture.
Firth the Fifth was one of those things where Tony just sort of, you know, we'd all get together to play each other our bits, of which he had hundreds, and Mike had quite a few, and Peter had a few, and we'd be steamrolling into playing Firth the Fifth.
Firth the Fifth was, well, obviously it's a kind of like a very strong sort of keyboard moment from the early years, and the way the guitar solo evolved is quite interesting, really, because I'd written, as I say, the three bits, and the second bit I'd written was just really a flute and piano melody, and I'd just seen it as that. And we were playing it, well, we'd played it a few times, it sounded really nice. And then one time Steve said, you know, started playing it, you know, and he started playing it sort of like this, and I thought, oh, great, and I started to put the mellotron in, big chords like this. It was almost like a joke. We were kind of doing it sort of like a la King Crimson, is how we saw it. I was just doing this overblown thing. I thought, actually, that's really good, this. So we then sort of, you know, so for the reprise of that melody, when it came in the second half of the song, we said, well, let's do it this big way and see how it works. And it worked really well. And it gave a chance for Steve to actually do a sort of proper guitar solo.
Tony's melody, which I tried to interpret in a kind of slightly sort of Middle Eastern sort of way. I was bending all the notes, and I remember one or two people said, "Oh, it sounds a little bit Indian, almost like a sitar," and there was a note that I was able to sustain that would work 9 times out of 10 at the top. You do a high F sharp, and just with proximity to the speaker cabinets, it fed back. So it sounded like I had perfect sustain on every note. I didn't, but I was able to fade in the notes on the beginning of it and sort of wait for it, coast over a sort of atmospheric section, and then play this melody, which I think, although it was written as a piano melody originally, it became a flute melody, and then it became this guitar melody, and it's kind of become Genesis' most well-known guitar solo. So yeah, I was allowed to play forever, it seems, this great long guitar solo in the middle of something written by Tony.
Steve, I think, was starting to really sort of find his feet a bit more on as a player live and everything. I mean, obviously he always contributed, you know, a lot of Genesis music obviously required sort of guitar, sort of acoustic guitar picking and stuff, where people notice it less, I think. People tend to notice lead playing a little bit more, and I suppose on this it was more of a genuine guitar solo. Some of the others are a bit tricksy, you know, he's kind of thinking very hard about every note he played, and so it doesn't sort of soar in quite the way that this does, where I think he, you know, allowed himself to actually have a bit more freedom, you know, with it. particularly before the main melody starts, just some really nice little phrases and stuff, so it sounds more like a real guitarist.
Once again, it's a nice section. It's about more space. We're taking the main theme from the song and just letting it run for about 4 minutes with a lovely guitar solo playing the melody and some lines in between. So we're starting to give sections more space and more time to sit in one mood rather than move on too fast.
Steve definitely, I think, gained in confidence, and 𝗜lich 𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗀𝗄 is very much a Tony piece in terms of its how it started and how it built. But Steve did let loose in, I think, probably the best way up to that point at the end.
Along the forest road, there's hundreds of cars, luxury cars. Each has got its load of convertible bars, cutlery cars, superstars.
Battle of Epping Forest is a classic example of what I was getting at with Can Utility and Get 'Em Out by Friday, where we had very well recorded as well. I mean, I remember, I can picture this, we were writing it, and we had some really good counter polyrhythmic bits happening, And then Peter took the song and wrote the lyric, and we recorded the track, and then he came in to sing the lyric, and we were just like, it's like 300 words a line, it was like there was no space, any air had been sucked out of it. And not to say that he was in the wrong or we were in the wrong. It's just that if we'd have only known, we could have thinned it out. And in those days, we didn't go back and re-record things, This is it. We've got our version. We have to make do, I mean, it's incredible to think about, isn't it, really? But, so we did play it live, but it was always a little bit... It was always like a barrage of information, sort of being thrown at you. So that was the classic example of when that stuff really got out a little bit out of hand.
Coming over the hill, the boys are building Johnny's leg, staying very still.
It's probably too busy, I'd spend a lot of time, building up this story with all these characters and setting scenes, and was quite reluctant to edit as severely as I should have done. So I think it did end up too wordy.
They called me the Reverend when I entered the church on stand.
Even at its weakest, Selling England by the Pound has got great moments on it. Great moments, great humour. Very funny bit in the middle of Epping Forest, Pete doing the vicar. Just brilliant.
Home from work, our Juliet clears her morning meal.
The other song on this album, I suppose, that kind of was a big development for us again was the cinema show, which was another one of those things that starts off with a sort of quiet, acoustic beginning and then ends up doing something else at the end. But I think the instrumental at the end of this was probably the best of the ones we did at this stage in our careers anyhow. Mike had this riff, which was just in 7, just going dang, 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 like that. And he was playing along. And I'd sort of just started fiddling around on top of it. And then we thought this could be really good. So again, Phil, Mike and I just went off really and put this all together. And worked on all these bits, and I just improvised for hours and got the little bits and pieces going. Then Mike would change the chords, and we ended up with this piece. And I think it's with such a strong rhythm in the first place. A lot of the things you play on it could be really good, but I got 1 or 2 quite good melodies on top of it, and it again built up to a very nice sort of climax, I think, and probably better on stage than it was on the album in many ways. But on the album, it sort of fades out into the next bit, which I'm not too sure is quite so good, but it was an exciting thing to have created at the time. I think we were very pleased with it.
The cinema show was lyrically, I think, Tony and Peter. I think. So either Tony and Peter or Mike and Peter. But anyway, and the end, of course, was just based on a guitar riff, a 7/8 drum riff. And then Tony just sort of had lots of bits on top, and eventually that became the themes, which are a very strong theme.
I think I was influenced, my playing on that, and there's not that much electric playing of mine. I was influenced by the flute work of Ian MacDonald working with King Crimson, so I tried to play very pastoral phrases. I developed it a bit more when we did it live, doing percussion noises and what have you. But in some ways, it typifies the Genesis sound because you've got almost a plethora of 12 strings going. Sometimes, 2 12 strings, sometimes 3, and an electric 6 string as well. And this jangly sound where you can't tell, it sounds almost, is that a keyboard? Is that a guitar? What is that sound?
The first part's again an example of when I tuned my 12 strings. And normally you have got 12 strings and they're paired up, and you tune each pair to the same note. I started tuning each pair to harmony notes, which is how the song starts with that sort of rundown. Now, what the hell the tuning is, I haven't got a clue, because the other day in New York we said, well, they were saying, let's do the first half of Cinema Show maybe, And I said, well, all right, but I had no idea how I played it, we'd have to work a compromised version out. But the second part, once again, seems to be, we started this move really, I think, with myself, Phil and Tony. And what I was doing, Steve, it's more about myself, Phil and Tony, playing, jamming and getting these instrumental moments, like, the back end of the 9/8 in So I Was Ready, this one, which became a large part of our trademark, really. And it was the instrumental part was a huge sort of crowd pleaser. Great live song.
I thought the cover was absolutely brilliant. 𝗵𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗶𝗄𝗏. The fact that she'd done that picture, she was a member of the Royal Academy, and I think it was the front cover of their catalogue advertising the summer exhibition.
She seemed to have, a good combination of Englishness and yet unraveling or exposing the underbelly. And I went down to see her, and then Tony and Margaret came down, and I think I went the first time on my own, but then they came down together, and she was a wonderful character, and she had a parrot, and she kept on talking to the parrot in the middle of the conversation. You weren't quite sure if you were being addressed or the parrot.
We had tea on her lawn, but what was great was she just put the table was on the lawn like that, and she put sort of the tea on that, and it was everything was sort of sliding down the thing, very strange. And the whole time we were there was this parrot that sat on Peter's shoulder, sort of nibbling his collar. It was kind of a somewhat surreal moment. Anyhow, she was an reasonably old lady. Anyhow, she said she'd love to do it, but she couldn't do anything from scratch in a month, which is what we needed, So we said, well, can you modify the picture that you've got, which is what she did. She just took the picture she'd had and she added a lawnmower to it so that it fitted with the lyrics to I Know What I Like, and put these people behind the things. And it worked really well. And I mean, in many ways, it's the best piece of art we've ever had on the front cover. Whether it's the best cover, I don't know, but it's the best piece of art on a cover.
So 𝗵𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗄 was a wonderful woman. She was a little bit like Miss Marple or an Agatha Christie character, full of life, very smart and mischievous.
She was a great old lady, and sort of nice seeing someone from the other world, not just the music world, someone in the art world who was up for sort of trying something.
For me, I mean, the cover was a great cover, the 𝗵𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗄 cover. That showed that there had been a change of sorts, and from that kind of very almost schoolboy graphic stuff, which was Foxtrot and Nursery Crime. In its way, it was done. I kind of felt it was a little schoolboyish. This was kind of something that was kind of elegant, the 𝗵𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗄 characters, and that stayed with us as well. I mean, it's a good album.
This album, I think we came together much more as players. I think it's the first, we sound convincing as players to a greater extent. In some ways, it was the most of the early albums. I suppose it's the most, it's a bit more technique in there and stuff. I always like to think the technique is just another sort of paintbrush in a way. It's something you can use, and it can be very effective at times. You should never take over. I think with some groups it sort of it takes over. It becomes the technique's the thing. You get a guitarist who can play so fast that you can't stop doing it and everything. And we're very happy to sort of sit down. I'm just very happy to just sit down and hold down chords, which I do a lot of the time. I think that's, and then other times you would go mad, and that sort of the contrast works, and you just use it, and it illustrates something you want to try and illustrate with the piece of music you're writing. And I think that's interesting. And as you said before, I think Steve's playing on this was really good. Or particularly, obviously, the 𝗜ጵ 𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗀𝗄 was a sort of standout moment, I think, for his time with us.
I do look back on this one with fondness, although I think the others, I suspect Tony and Mike might have felt that the songs weren't as strong on it. I felt that it was an album that was big on atmosphere, very well arranged, very well played, lots of very interesting techniques, and everyone, playing and toying with things, where form was perhaps secondary to the spirit of it. So there's no other album in the world that any other band has made that sounds remotely like that. There is no album that Genesis made that sounds remotely like that. So I love it for its eccentricity, its invention, and I was thrilled with it, and I still am.
I always likened Selling England and Nursery Crime as sort of similar feeling albums in my mind. I think the good bits are good and the bad bits are a bit dodgy, but I think there's some strong bits there, definitely. And of course our first semi-hit single, almost. Who'd have thought?
There were things that I was less happy with than others, and obviously I think you follow your own bits and pieces further through than everybody else's, but it's I think some of them could have been a bit sharper. I mean, for example, I mentioned the chorus of Know What I Like, which didn't last for me as a pleasurable experience, even though, got us a hit. Most of our stuff took a few plays to sort of open up to a listener. But if they got it, it would stick around for quite a long time.
And the rain lies down on Broadway.
It was a strange period, actually. I mean, the Lamb kind of started for me. I can remember driving into Headley Grange. I had Andy, my first wife, with me, and I had Jolie with me. And there was this kind of, it was a bit like going into a Dickens novel, it was like this, windows broken and rats everywhere. There were rats everywhere. Bad Company had used it, and Zeppelin had used it, and they'd recorded the When the Levee Breaks album there. But no one had cleaned up. It was really odd. I mean, this poor woman that owned the house, I don't think she knew what she was letting herself in for. But literally there were rats everywhere. So you'd walk in and you'd be walking down the corridor and 2 or 3 rats would walk past you. They wouldn't scurry away. They just walk past you and stop and look at you. Say, "What? Yeah, got a problem?" And then in the back garden, there was these vines, up the back wall, and you'd see this constant scurry of activity. And I was bringing a daughter into this, where we were going to stay the night. I mean, at night when you went to bed, you could hear the scurrying around it. I mean, the place never slept. So, first of all, we had to clear up, but we never got rid of the rats. I mean, they were always there. And it was kind of weird time.
I remember talking to Robert Plant about this. They worked in the same place. Zepp had worked at Headley Grange. And he said, I'm convinced that place was haunted. I said, me too. I heard the sounds at night. I couldn't get off to sleep. That place was weird.
So we took over the living room to write, and there was another room with a piano, which I guess during the first few weeks of this, there must have been discussions, which I was there for. But I don't remember much about who wrote the lyrics. It was one story, okay. One story, one lyric writer. which I guess in theory is the way to go. But so what I remember mostly about the Lamb was the four of us in the big room, jamming and writing and recording on my 𝗁𝗁𝗄𝗁𝗃𝗁, everything, and in the other room, Peter writing lyrics to the things that were already there. Which means that, I mean, obviously we did play some stuff all together, but it was like him and us. It seemed, you know, my shutter went off at those moments. That's what I remember.
Concept and lyric were all Peter's, and I'm not. I mean, I have to be honest, and I say that I think the actual story is the weakest thing about the album. I mean, I don't think the story is really very gripping. Some of the individual lyrics are wonderful, I think, but the totality just doesn't move me. It doesn't do anything for me, really. It reads a bit like a sort of Kurt Vonnegut novel or something, you know, without perhaps quite as good imagery. And I just that's always stays with me, really. It doesn't satisfy me in the way that some of the other albums do. I mean, the Supper's Ready concept was a much simpler thing, you know, good and evil, you know, but that worked great, I think. But this one, not so well.
The story is in a way it's like a Pilgrim's Progress, but on the streets of New York. So it's a spiritual journey into the soul, and but there's quite a tough world that is feeding the imagery and the starting point. So one of the influences on me was a film called El Topo by Alejandro Jodorowsky, who I invited later to work on the screenplay for The Lamb with me. And this was a rough, visceral, cowboy, spiritual film, and it was unique at the time. Had a really strong cult following, and that was the blend that I was trying to put together in a way that would allow more people to try and travel with me.
I think maybe we decided to do a double album to give ourselves a bit more space, as simple as that. I think, you know, you could do them, and we felt a single album rather constrained you. And I think we had this idea, if I remember, that by making it a much longer time scale to work on music, you know, you could do these little jams, improvisations. It would give us a chance to be a little bit freer with how we were playing, I think.
I think when we started writing, and we seemed to have quite a lot of ideas on The Lamb, we thought it would be, the idea of making it a double album concept would be adventurous and would be quite a nice thing to try and do, you know. We had no idea what the concept was going to be or anything, but we felt that the audience our audience would be able to take it, you know. And so we found it quite an exciting idea of things to do. And then obviously we had to set about and think about what was the concept going to be about. And I think at this point, Peter sort of had an idea, and he seemed quite keen to do all the lyrics, which was something which we'd never done before. The lyrics have been very much split throughout the group prior to this time. And we weren't really in favour of this, you know. I mean, to be honest, I think the rest of us, because it felt that it would give the album a one-dimensional quality. And I think lyrically, I mean, for me, it does have that for that reason. And but anyhow, I think, you know, perhaps the relationships in the group was getting a little bit more, you know, wasn't quite as easy as it once had been. Probably because Peter was being thrust out as the star in a way, you know. Media would only concentrate on Peter really, which was strange in a group that was sort of as democratic as we were in a way, you know, in the way everything came with music and everything was done. So that was a little bit difficult for us, I think. And obviously during the making of, while we were actually writing this album, Peter actually got an offer to do this film script for 𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗃𝗁𝗁, and he decided he was going to do it and went off. And that was in the middle of the writing.
Looks at you once, you know he understands.
I'd written a story, you know, from having done these introduction stories, which went on the back of the live album. And it was about a woman who began sort of stripping in a tube train and taking off her clothes. Anyway, eventually she strips herself down, and all that's left is this sort of tube of light. And it was something that caught 𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 he'd just done Exorcist. And he wanted to use that power to try and reinvent Hollywood and bring in a whole new team of people. And he invited me in as an ideas person, to brainstorm and come up with different concepts in different areas. He'd actually approached Tangerine Dream to do the music. And there was a guy called 𝗜lich𝘁𝗲𝗶𝗲𝘄𝘀, who was from Heavy Metal magazine. There was an animated designer that he wanted to work on some of the visuals. And to me, it was a very exciting opportunity. Not because it was Hollywood so much, but because I love ideas, I love brainstorming with smart people, and that was suddenly going to be given a vehicle and given a chance to come to life. So I really wanted to do it. And I think even though, Phil has always been a sort of jobbing musician and doing other things, there was from I think Tony, and to some extent Mike, this feeling, well, I think it was a bit, why should he have all the fun? But it was the sense that, no, we're not happy to make time for you to go off and piss away valuable band time when you should be committed and turning up at 9 o'clock every morning. And that was a sort of hot, contentious issue.
And so he did leave, because we gave him an ultimatum: you choose Friedkin or you stay with the band. So he went. William Friedkin I didn't want to split the band up. I don't even know if this is going to work. This is just an idea. So Peter comes back. But at that point, of course, we all know that this could happen at any time. My first feeling when Peter left was, okay, well, the vocals get in the way anyway. Let's just do it instrumentally. Let's just get rid of all the vocals and just do it instrumental. We all like the instrumental bits anyway. So, of course, that was poo-pooed, quite rightly. And Peter came back and we carried on writing. And then we went to Wales, this farm in Wales, to record it with John Burns and a mobile. And that was great fun.
We had our first child, Jill, who was married to at the time. It was, as it is for anyone really, it's suddenly the most important thing in your life by a long way. And we had a disastrous birth. We were all set for sort of natural birth, putting her on the breast. She had an infection which was given to her from an epidural needle, which wasn't clean, so she had a fever, Jill had the fever, cord round her neck, lungs full of gunk, everything was going wrong, and we didn't think she was going to survive. They put her in an incubator, carried her away like a piece of chicken carcass wrapped up in silver paper, and they actually wouldn't let my wife see her because they thought it would be cruel for her to bond with the baby who wasn't going to make it through. Chances were so low. I mean, they wouldn't do that nowadays, but they thought they were being kind. That was then the center of everything. And the band, of course, were recording instead of somewhere reasonably close to London, where we were in St Mary's, Paddington, out in Wales. And I was making these sort of long pilgrimages beforehand, and then I would be based here, and then whenever things looked better, I'd try and zoom back to Wales for the recording. So this was something that the band, I think, would accept now, that they were not very understanding, and I just lost it in lots of ways, because I felt, this is so obviously more important than an album or anything else. This is life and death, and it's the center of my family. That's where I need to be. And there was a lot of resentment about that. So I think the seeds for the beginning of the end were sown at that point.
To be honest, we always, looking back, we were so unsupportive. We were like young into the album, intense, this is what we're doing, And Pete, poor old Pete, having to, deal with a terribly traumatic birth, and touch and go and dramas, we gave no help at all, actually, which I think must have been hard.
It was very difficult. My marriage was breaking up. It looked as if, we only had half a singer. The level of commitment to the band seemed shaky at that point. So for me, it cast a pall on proceedings. And although I think it's a very inventive album and has got great moments on it, I still feel there was this sense of claustrophobia that accompanied it for me. The idea that we were still trying to employ the philosophy of everyone going away together and living together cheek by jowl, but there were families, there were children. It really wasn't a healthy kind of environment for everybody.
The scent grows richer. He knows he must be near. He finds a long passageway lit by chandelier.
To try and keep everybody happy, there would be parts of it where, we'd be discussing lyrics and throwing some of the words around for different bits. And so the Lamia, which was so Tony's musical piece, or supernatural anaesthetist, was Steve had brought in. So then, they would discuss some of the lyrical stuff with me because they'd sort of got the writer's ticket. But, I was pretty anal about hanging on to some lyrical flow through and, being able to put a stamp on it. I really wanted a sort of tougher edge to this record than we'd had previously. And I didn't think there was anyone else in the band that was going to deliver that.
Struck by beauty, gripped in fright. 3 vermilion snakes of female face, the smallest motion filled with grace.
I think the sound on The Lamb is better. It was slightly more like they were recording us live. I said earlier that we always felt like the live sound was good, and on record it was a bit of a struggle to get it back good enough as it was in the room. We recorded in a room, and I think that made it feel, the drums had more of a live feel. And I think that the sound improved a lot. I mean, there's some good sound on this album, I think, because of the idea of not being in a studio, being in a live room, and sort of miking that more like we're sort of playing together on stage. So I think the sound was quite an improvement for us, yeah.
Some of those tracks sound even a bit like Neil Young, the kind of the barn recordings of Neil Young with Crazy Horse, you can. It's just, it has that kind of, not a studio, not soundproof, but very woody quality. So
coming back to it and doing the remixes and everything, what's actually on the tapes is really good, and to be honest, the original mix isn't bad either, I don't think, on this album. There's less change on this than, say, on the previous records, which is quite a bit of changing going on. I mean, still do a lot with it, a lot of moments you can really have fun with. And, things like with the 5.1, you can sort of, the different characters, like on Slipper Men, you sort of voices out the back and things, which is quite nice. So it's disconcerting things like that happening. So we tried quite hard to make it a sort of interesting 5.1 mix as well as the new stereo. So it works pretty well.
Rock face moves to press my skin. White liquid turns sour within. Turn fast, turn sour.
It was a dark time, I think, and so it felt as if we were sort of still living that dream of isolating ourselves and being in a sort of supposedly nurturing creative environment, but it wasn't working on lots of different levels yet. I think still some of our best material of the period when I was there in The Lamb Lies Down, and that's still one of the things looking back that I feel proud of. So there is, I think, quite often this irony when you get really shitty things going on in life, and yet the creativity that comes out of it can still be strong, interesting, and move people.
You know, we just had more space on this album because the double album. I know it sounds very simple to say it, but that meant you could actually breathe a bit, you know, not rush from section to section. And of course we took it live, played America, before the album was out. So we're playing the whole show, a new album that's not out, concept double album. And thinking about it, it was madness really, but actually it went down okay.
In terms of songs, I always think of The Lamb Lies Down itself being the sort of last song that Peter and I kind of ever wrote together, because we'd written a lot in the early days together and things. And you know, it was a pretty good song to end on, really. But the rest of the album, sort of, as I said, it was kind of, I don't know what it is, something about it. I think the lyrics, although they're good lyrics, but it means that no song really kind of stands out on its own. You know, what could have been, say, some really pretty song like The Lamia, for example. I mean, if you start singing that out of context, it makes no sense at all. You know, you sort of talk about snakes and stuff. And so I slightly resent that aspect of it, I suppose. And the one we obviously, there's two songs we perform quite often out of context from there, which one is In the Cage, which sort of almost works, although the Brother John bit in the middle lyrically doesn't make much sense, but I think it's a really strong piece of music, so it all stands up. And then the other one's The Carpet Crawlers, which works because it's got a chorus that kind of could relate to anything. I mean, the verse lyrics are pretty strange if you listen to them, but they're some lovely imagery in there as well, so I think that works well out of context.
It's not a record company album, that. You know, the record company will come and say, what the fuck is that on there? You've got to get rid of that. There's no singing on that. Get rid of that. You know, so and that was what was wonderful about Stratton Smith. And, you know, he would just try to deal with whatever we gave him. And Atlantic did their best like that too, because Ahmet was a big music person, and, you know, he probably didn't understand anything about The Lamb Lies Down at all. It's just that he could see that it was something adventurous, and he just kind of crossed his fingers and hoped that we weren't mad, you know.
The carpet crawlers, he dare call us. We gotta get him to get out.
Well, Carpet Crawlers, it's difficult to know really. When we wrote it, we actually had a couple of moments in the story that Peter had some action, which we didn't have any music for. So we sort of were sitting in the room, and Mike and I just sort of started just doodling, you know, and played this very simple chord sequence to develop this idea, just the thing. And you know, so that we said, well, there you go, there's a basis. And then Pete wrote this thing on top of it.
And of the melody of that track, because I worked my ass off on that. It was actually, I was staying mainly with at Jill's parents' place, which was in Kensington, and there was an old out-of-tune piano, but I spent hours and hours honing that melody in, and then the lyric.
Worked really well. It's one of those things, very simple, you know, and I think that's half its charm. Sometimes with Genesis it's a bit overworked and we sort of put too much into things, and something like this, which is, you know, almost a sort of bog standard sort of chord sequence in a way. Well, the chorus is a little bit different, but it just gave it somewhere to go. And I think I don't know why. You know, what is it? It's got it. I think the sort of the fact the song slowly crescendos, you know, and it kind of just sort of creeps into you like that. It's got a very strong chorus hook as well, I think. Which is why I think why audiences like it, I don't know really. It shines out a little bit from the album in terms of its sort of solidity and confidence, I think, because the other songs I say are all a bit more meandering, and you just think there's one very sort of bright spark in the middle of the album like this, which at the time we wrote it, we had no idea that it was going to be picked out like that. You know, we played the album to people and we thought that probably the single would, if there was going to be a single, it would be Counting Out Time, and everyone said no, Carpet Crawlers is the one, you know. We released the single, of course, it wasn't a hit or anything, but we've tried again. We tried it a couple of times since then, releasing it. It's still never done anything.
Early morning, man had on ocean winds blow on the land. Movie palaces now undone.
I think the title track, you know, the opening track, I think is great. The piano riff, and Pete sets up the image, describing the New York scenes, you know. Early Morning Skyline, those sort of lines, you know, I think they really paint a picture of the album.
Rise
I remember it. We were really pushed to get the album finished, and we were at Island Studios. And by this point we had a day shift and a night shift, and I was on the night shift with Peter, I think. And the day shift was Tony and Mike and Steve. And we did a mix of it, me and Pete. And then the other guys came in and thought we were mad and changed everything. And there was a bit of friction there, I remember. But we were just trying to get it finished and try and get it out.
I'm counting out time. Got the whole thing down by numbers. All those numbers give me guidance.
Well, I think Counting Out Time is played because it's a pop song, you know, in the way that some of the other ones are. It's that was a song of Pete's, actually, Counting Out Time, entirely, which I think is a good little song. I mean, it works very nicely. You know, I think it's good in context of the album again because it's simpler compared with a lot of the other things.
I think Counting Out Time was the nearest thing to a single on the album, but it was a trifle risque.
It's all about early sexual experiences, trying to do it by the book.
Possibly not as strong as it could be musically. I think you need a bit more of a hook than just da 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 da, you know.
And I love Back in New York City. That was just a weird track. I mean, it was just out there, so heavy for us.
Back in New York City.
I think I wrote it with the band. I can't remember actually, but I think it was sort of, and a lot of jamming, a lot of improvising. And I know we were conscious at the time. We were thinking that it's kind of a shame when Pete wanted to move on because we thought this is sounding really good musically, very strong, and I think at the end it's still a strong piece.
That started off as a riff of Mike's. He just had this idea of playing on. He had a 6-string bass and he was playing this riff on it, and then we sort of developed that as a song, and then Pete just did this sort of shouting type vocal on it, which was kind of, at the time, was sort of quite surprising, you know, but I think it works pretty well. Again, I think the song is a bit more complicated than it needs to be. I think there's a couple of little extra bits in the middle there that should probably, courtesy of me, in fact, I think, which probably be better off if they weren't there, but they are there, so that's what you've got.
People have covered it. I mean, Back in New York City has been covered by a couple of different bands recently that I've got. You know, I managed to get hold of these things when I hear about them. But yeah, I mean, just from my point of view as a player, I mean, I was playing. I mean, I went to see the Musical Box play this in its entirety, and I was amazed at just how complicated it was. And this guy was playing it well, but I mean, I must have played it better. You know what I mean? Because I wrote it, and I mean, my drum set was like, you know, like huge. I mean, it wasn't like big drum kit. It was just like lots of noises here, lots of things there, and I was whizzing around it. I mean, it was probably the height. I mean, certainly between that and then the next 3 or 4 years with Brand X and Genesis, that was probably the height of my playing, you know. But a lot of inventive stuff, you know, from everybody. I mean, Steve was, you know, like a great sound guy, and, you know, Tony was getting the maximum out of what he had. You know, we were onto the double neck kind of thing with the guitar and bass. And it seemed to be a very, you know, a surge forward, really. Well, I just think that they display a side of Genesis that no one really, well, everyone forgets, apart from the ardent fan. They forget, or they've never heard. And I think it's actually the way we start writing now, by doing things like that. That's how I Can't Dance started. That's how No Son of Mine started. That's how all these songs. That's how we used to write. You know, we just would start playing, and our brief on the waiting room, for example, was. The mood we want is darkness to light. And I remember I had this, I think it's out there as a bootleg, I don't know how, because I had the only cassette, but I used to cassette everything. I was the keeper of the tapes, you know, I'm still the writer of the minutes of the meetings, you know. But we started making noises, Steve with his darkness, and lots of rain sticks and eerie noises, And suddenly, you know, Tony would start playing these chords, and I went, drum, 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 drum. And literally, it was pouring with rain outside. And we kind of, Tony put some chords in, and suddenly it started changing rhythm from dum 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 dum, and there was a rainbow, and it stopped raining, and the sun came out. I mean, it's most cosmic thing, you know. I mean, there's nothing. I just only report the news. I don't make it. I was there, and it happened, and it was the most amazing thing. And it was just a little golden 8 or 9 minute moment. And that's what those are the bits that I remember. And I think it would be good if people kind of remembered that side of it. That's the same band, like Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats, which is like, you know, sailing ships, you know, like clouds and fog. The same band that plays Hold On My Heart. The same band that plays the songs that they say we've sold out to. It's the same band, you know, it's the same mentality.
It's the last great invention left to mankind. Screams a drooping lady, offering her dream dolls at less than extortionate prices.
Eno was upstairs taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, and Peter was a fan of Roxy Music. I guess they were. I'd never heard of Roxy. I've heard of them, but I'd never heard their music. Anyway, he asked Eno to come down and put the vocals through his ARP. So he did, and that Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging was one of the things he did. And after we'd finished that, some deal was made, and I was sent upstairs to play drums on Eno's record, which was fine by me because I ended up getting to know him very well and playing on Another Green World and Before and After Science and Music for Films, you know, and we've stayed in touch. But I felt like some kind of prostitute, you know. He's come down and played on our record. Now you're going to have to go and pay him back, you know. Like, what do I have to do? Just play the drums. Oh, good. I
was and am still, you know, a fan of what Brian does and brings to projects, and it just seemed like this was for us an adventurous album, and that I really wanted him to come in and wave his magic wand over a few of the sort of sound areas, which we called enossification.
It's a funny album, this really, because I suppose it's sort of looked back on as something of a classic. I didn't really enjoy sort of writing or making this album to the same extent as I did all the other albums. I mean, there's a lot of my stuff on this album, I have to say. A lot of bits some bits I had around for a while, and, you know, particularly with the bits that ended up in obviously The Lamb and The Cage, and, you know, and Lamy and Slipperman and all that sort of stuff. And we did a lot of improvising as well and created these bits. And I think some of the most exciting bits on the album are actually these little interludes that we had. One of my favourite ones is the one we ended up calling a Fly on a Windshield, I think, which was originally was called Pharaohs. And we just sort of sat down and was playing sort of fifths and just making it sort of like the Egyptian army sort of coming across the landscape was the idea, you know. And we had a sort of quiet one and a loud one, and we just sort of butt joined them. But then with the lyric, the idea of this sort of fly hitting a windshield, and of course it comes in with such a big bang, which is probably the single best moment in Genesis. I think that's just that moment when it comes in, that first chord. After that, it's just downhill, but it's just a wonderful moment, I think.
And I'm hovering like a fly, waiting for the windshield on the freeway.
I was trying very, very hard to get my guitar through the mix a lot of the time, and I was trying very hard on very, very dense keyboard textures, and I'm always trying to do something to highlight and try and do something sympathetic in the background. Although you've got guitar moments like Fly on a Windshield, where you've got the guitar doing something where it sometimes comes to the fore and, you know, rises and falls, and so I think that is a lovely piece of music. So as a guitarist, I love that.
I wandered lonely as a cloud till I came upon this dirty street.
I've always loved visual things, you know, and obviously since then, and it's the chance of having interesting looking visuals or get a reaction from people, much in the same way that the Fox's head in the dress had got a strong reaction. The Slipper Man, was a really ugly-looking thing, and I would crawl out of his phallus, which would unroll on the stage, and it was a great moment.
I was starting to sort of just feel like the music was being overshadowed by the visuals, which were getting a little bit out of hand. I mean, the idea of having these screens behind us was fantastic, but I mean, they never worked. I mean, we had maybe 4 shows in 100. When everything actually changed at the right moment. We sort of 2 eyes. We had an eye and a New York street scene, because the slide changer didn't work. And we, all that stuff was frustrating, but it was nothing we could do about it. But there was 2 things. One was the lamia, where this thing came down and Peter was in the middle of it, and sometimes the microphone cord would get caught up with the top or the bottom of it. And so either it didn't move or he had to move with it. It was all very Spinal Tap, But, I mean, it was cutting edge, but Spinal Tap. And the worst was the Slipper Man, where he came through this inflatable dick, and dressed in this horrible outfit, which sometimes got a little bit stuck on the way out, and other times when he did make it out, the microphone could barely get near his throat, and then he was out of breath. I mean, there's a lot of words in that song, and he was running around. I mean, he kind of hadn't really thought it through, I don't think.
Phil's absolutely correct that it was bloody hard to sing inside there. We didn't have those little tiny mics, so inside this mask I was trying to hold the microphone and tripping up over things, and at different points I'd crawl under Tony's organ, appear at different places, but it was just trying to explore things and push it a lot and have fun, because it was fun. But again, it was a little like with the lyric. I knew that if everything went to the vote, it would die a horrible death. So again, the way it was performed, I mean, there was, I would, on the visual stuff and the slides, I worked a lot with this 𝗜脾𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗶𝗲𝘄𝘀 and 𝗜脾𝘁𝘁𝗲𝗿𝗃𝗏, and then we'd have sessions, and then I would sort of present them to the band, and Jeffrey was a very good people person. That side of things, there weren't any real problems or battles once people felt good that there was something interesting and of quality coming. But as always, what I did in terms of masks, costumes and all that stuff, I just had to get on with it and not offer it up to the vote.
It's what Spinal Tap was written for. It's funny, and it was adventurous, and it was edgy, and it was like nobody else, and we should be thankful that we were all in the same band experiencing it. But I didn't think it was very musical, that's all.
Well, I think it works pretty well. Obviously, it's the idea was it's showing sort of images from the story and everything, and it has that kind of it has a sort of graphic novel sort of quality about it, which I quite like, because I'm a bit of a graphic novel fan, and so I quite like the sort of dark thing about it. I think it was, it was a question of how we used it, whether we used it sort of bigger and over the whole album, or whether we just used that sort of band of stuff. I think it works pretty well. I mean, it's in a lot of character, and also the writing, that sort of Greek lettering we used, which we've obviously come back to a few times later in our career, I think looks very strong on it, really. I think it was good because it gave whereas all the previous albums have all been a bit more romantic, this was a lot less romantic, this album, and having a stark black and white cover like that, I think it made you aware that this wasn't going to be quite as sort of cuddly, perhaps, as some of the previous stuff.
I really liked Storm. It was a wonderful character, very dry, cynical, sardonic, very talented, and he was just a lot of fun to interact with. He was always rude to everybody, and but when you're riffing ideas, it's a lot of fun, and he also has this bag of the unused hypnosis ideas that he tries to palm off on everyone as new and fresh, but here there was a story and some strong ideas for pictures. We had a lot of, I had a sort of Puerto Rican figure in my head who, perhaps West Side Story was maybe another influence as well as 𝗏𝘁𝗲𝗏𝗄𝗏. But the faces that they were able to find in the UK didn't seem anything like what I had in my head, and we had, I remember, a big search to try and find someone acceptable as Rael, because I thought the face has to be right. And I think we got pretty close, but it was sort of like 8.5 out of 10.
Hypnosis for years have been trying to get us to use a photographic cover. They always wanted everything to be edgy realism, and the band always wanted something much more, to their mind, that what Hypnosis considered to be airy-fairy. Oh yes, you want all this romantic stuff. Why can't you have something which is contemporary, photographic, literal, perspectives-driven, just like all their other covers? And the cover, I don't think it's the greatest cover ever. I think that Hypnosis did do great covers, occasionally for Led Zeppelin, who I think were perhaps more open to some of their ideas. Like I remember them saying, what about if we have a family sitting around and they're staring at something in the middle of the table and no one really knows what it is? And everyone says, no, don't like that. But everyone was sure that they didn't want their photograph on the front. No one wanted their own face to be on the front of the album. Probably not until Phil did Face Value, but that's another story.
Yeah, I feel it's a little bit as confused as the story. I mean, it's a distinct package. I don't think I've ever read the story inside it, actually. It's been one of those things where it's something I should have done, and then it became too late, and there was something else to do, so I never. But again, it's difficult when someone plonks an album in front of you to sign. What you're signing, very quickly someone goes, okay, picture. The filing cabinet in your head goes back to all the things that. So every album cover has, straight away, even though you're signing your name on something that's 30 years old plus, it has those sort of emotional attachments. Some good, some not so good, but at least evoke something.
I guess maybe because it was in part a visualization of a story that I may have, moved beyond the democratic process, and that didn't go down well.
Fragrance to flavor strange, a magnificent chamber.
Pete said he was going to leave, and he did. And I remember talking to him on a plane one day. I said, "Are you seriously going to leave at the end of this?" I mean, he said, "Yeah, afraid so. Yeah, I made up my mind." And he's putting me on. It's all part of the act. It's all part of the show. It's like the makeup is going to come off. But no, it was not an act. It was real.
As I said many times, when Peter and I started off in the group as sort of, kind of very best friends, I suppose, really. And obviously by then it was getting a little more difficult, I think, particularly within the group. So yes, it was a sort of sad time in that way. And you sort of felt that, particularly once when we did the tour, we did about 100 shows of The Lamb, which wasn't a fantastic show, to be honest, I don't think. Although we tried very hard and had lots of good effects. It was trying to do the whole album, to an audience who really wanted to hear a lot of the old hits, made it a little more difficult.
But it was a bit strange to be carrying on doing gigs knowing the singer was leaving. I must admit, it was a bit strange. Must have been strange, And then I think the last gig was cancelled, so the gig we were actually at became our last show. So that was a bit of an anticlimax. There was no kind of build-up because the next show had been cancelled because no one bought tickets. Toulouse, we all disagree on where the last show is. It's incredible. I'm convinced that Toulouse was cancelled and we ended it with the five of us in Besançon. Everybody else tells me we ended in Saint-Etienne, but you'd think someone would know, wouldn't you? Apparently I'm wrong, but I'm pretty convinced I'm right. Anyway, the last show was cancelled, so that was the end of that.
I think I started to have some frustration of sort of not being part of the keyboard side of things, I have very strong ideas on how things should sound and how you mix things together, and so I think there may have been some frustrations in that department.
I think something happened when he left for a bit, you know, and you're in your mind you're thinking, wait a minute, this guy's got, maybe he's going to pull somewhere else, different directions. He wants to think outside the band. And so when he finally did break the news, it was not such a huge shock. We had a kind of pre-warning, you know. I just managed to persuade Tony Smith to leave his business and become a manager. Poor guy out there, suddenly, you know. The singer leaves, and I'm sure he thought, oh God, what have I done? But it's funny. In a sense, talking about it now, you said it seems a long period. It's not a long period, you're right, but I'm talking about it now. I think a lot of tours, a lot of work, a lot of gigs, a lot of music, in a sort of 5-year period, actually. I remember seeing once the list of gigs we did 1 year. It was like 190 or no, 200 in 1 year. No, 210 in 1 year, you know, that's a lot of gigs. But it became a bit of a landmark album and an end of an era too, you know, I think.
I mean, you know, one of the several reasons why I left was because that I didn't feel able to control, or that I was in charge of my life, that, you know, I could just look on the calendar and see exactly where I was going to be 18 months from today, and I never liked that feeling.
I have to say that there's been sort of little rumours on and off throughout the years that because of my apparent, you know, unhappiness at Pete's visuals, that I was either an instigator of him leaving, pleased that he left so I could sing, you know. None of that is true, you know. I love Peter to this day as if he, you know, we've always been close. I played on his album, I played for him as his drummer for free because he couldn't afford a band at one point, you know. We did gigs when he was routining the third album. I love the guy, you know. I mean, went to his wedding and you came to mine. I mean, we all get on great, but I've always felt very, very close to Pete. And I was very sad when he left, but we had to get on with it. And I didn't want to be the singer at all, because I was the drummer. And by that point, I was a very good drummer. So why would I want to sing? We couldn't find anybody else. So if we couldn't find anybody else, that was the end of it. Or have someone that didn't really make the grade, you know. So bit by bit, I ended up doing the singing. And but you know, people always take the short story. You know, they take the shortest route, and they think Phil's the singer. He's had a go at Pete. He wanted him out.
It's bullshit. Phil, yeah, some people think, yeah, that Phil was sort of chomping at the bit, waiting to get rid of me. And it wasn't like that at all. I think he loved being a drummer, and although I think was beginning to write songs and enjoy being a singer, for quite some time the band didn't consider him as the singer. And I don't think he really considered himself as the singer for Genesis. So that evolved slowly. It was clear to me that he could have a big career on his own, and I remember, you know, saying that to him and to the rest of the band at the time. And because, as I said, we would often be there hammering out our own things, which were sounding quite different from what the band was doing. Yeah, it wasn't. I never had the feeling that the band wanted to get rid of me at any time, and I think because we started the tour for the Lamb, and that, you know, got great reactions. People were hoping that, you know, things would all heal, and then we got to the Midwest of America, and it just got too much for me, and I just knew that I was drowning and had to head up for air.
I think it's looked upon now like in the same way that James Dean, you know, only made 3 films, I think, 4 films, but I mean, everyone thinks he's a wonderful actor, and I think everyone looks back at The Lamb with a lot of reverence, but they didn't like it at the time, you know. I think it was, but I'm glad that they got round to it now, but it didn't take the world by storm when it came out, that's for sure.
Musically, there was a confidence and an assurance about what we were doing as writers and players, more than on any other record up to that point. So, yeah, there were all these different sort of out of balance elements that ended up making what I think is a good record. There's one or two weak points where it sort of fizzled out in places, but some of our strongest work.
Yeah, I mean the good bits are good. It was a long album to make. I think a double album is hard to do, especially if things aren't going quite right, like Pete leaving for a bit. And on reflection, I'm guessing it had to be that way. Peter write all the lyrics. You couldn't mix it up, but it made it. His work there very, very hard, and I think kind of took him away from us really. And sort of he just got into a space and just worked on lyrics, and did some great lyrics, but it's still quite. It slightly made us two camps, so to speak. But a good way to end, I think,
Well, I can listen to it without rancor, and I don't remember the pain. I just can enjoy it as a piece of music now, and say, yeah, I think it was a clever album. Lots of great keyboard work. Not so many opportunities for the guitar to shine, but where it does, I think it's interesting. I tend to think that it parallels, yes, doing Topographic Oceans at that point, a double concept album, and us doing a double album. And I know that very often the guys have felt that maybe it would have made a great single album if the best stuff had been kept. But what would you have kept? What would you have thrown away? Kept my bit, of course. To hell with all the rest.
No, I think it's great that we went out on a good piece of work. And there was never really bad feeling with the individuals. I mean, that we had, like any sort of divorce, there was difficulties, but most of what they wanted, I was prepared to give them, including extra touring time and my tape archive, most of the equipment and stuff. And so it was, at that point, I think they were worried whether they'd be able to continue without me. And clearly they were much more successful without me. So there was actually no real issue. But I think everyone had doubts and were very frustrated because we worked a long time to get some success. We were about to get some financial rewards, which we hadn't fully paid off. So when this bastard goes and sabotages the whole thing just as it gets successful, that wasn't a popular thing to do from a career point of view.
I think it's quite a difficult album. It's very dark and quite dense. But I think, therefore, people sort of, I think people, if you try at it, it still works really well, I think, and I think it's rewarding, and perhaps it takes a little bit more to get into it in the first place, and maybe for that reason, people, once they've got there, hold it up like that. But I think, in honesty, that's the thing about Genesis. Is a strange thing. We don't have any one album that everyone's going to say this is the one. Pink Floyd have got Dark Side of the Moon, whatever. With us, you'll get people saying any album. I've had every album said this is the one, part possibly from Genesis Revelation. I think it's just how you hear things. Sometimes it's at what point in your life you hear a thing, and you're a teenager or something, it hits you harder when you're sort of 15 than it does perhaps when you're sort of 25, and so it stays with you for that reason.